All right, so this is a little bit more of the fun part. You know, number one, purpose and mood. Typefaces, whether you know it or not, they have some personality. And I think you can kind of see the difference in personality in the example I have up on the screen. The first lorem ipsum is a whimsical and fun font called Ravy, and then the lorem ipsum on the bottom is more serious and definitely more formal, and that's in Helvetica New. You know, when you start to think about different personalities, do you want a typeface that is the font equivalent of a floral shirt in Bermuda shorts, or a nice, crisp business suit? Do you want to mix and match for various sections of content? Remember, you can only choose the right typeface if you keep the nature of the content and target audience in mind. So since using Times New Roman time and time again, see what I did there, gets boring and a fun new pictorial font can easily outlast its welcome, the key is to definitely learn to strike that balance between a trusted classical font and the snazzy, stylish, and novelty-laden personality fonts. Hierarchy-wise, for body text, it's always advisable to use a non-gimmicky, legible, and formal typeface such as Helvetica or Garamond. And if you wanted typography on your website to stand out a little from 99% of the web, try using a distinctive yet sufficiently low-key typeface that does not upstage your actual content on your page. You can get more creative with headings, banners, and text bites by using your favorite display font, but remember that most end users only have a limited number of standard typefaces installed on their computer. So if you want to get super cool and crazy creative typefaces to show up exactly like it is on systems worldwide, you would need to use a web font service. And the good thing about Adobe is, because Adobe is taking over the planet when it comes to design, they have Adobe Typekit now. Next up, so you can see a couple of different purposes and moods and how each of these really has the feeling of the word that's typed out. You know, this is definitely an angry font. This is a little bit comical. This feels romantic. This feels techy. Now, can you guys think of any other types of fonts that are moods when it comes to a font? And if you can think of some, you can type them in the chat. I think probably children or kids or something childish, that's probably a mood. So we have collegiate, creepy, horror and scary, gothic, theatrical, historic, retro, movement, all different moods. Next up, we have serif or sans serif. So Garamond is a popular serif typeface, while a Disney display is a sans serif. And most people find themselves wondering if, am I serif or sans serif? I feel as though I'm a sans serif person. And sans serif means that they don't have, your font doesn't have these little feet down at the bottom and at the top. See, no little feet coming off. Little decorations. So a quick way of organizing possible typeface choices is to use the most widely used typographical categorization, which is serif or sans serif. Most of us will know what these terms mean, but for some newbies, serif fonts have feet. Like I said, on Garamond, these are considered the feet. And sans serif fonts don't have feet, basically, without feet. That's pretty much what that means. So you will be able to see this difference clearly in the snapshot that I've included, which has Garamond in that Admisi, I said it wrong the first time, display. They say that serif fonts provide continuity and engagement, and therefore improve readability. But detractors, and those are people like me, the sans serif supporters, call that a typographical myth. I definitely think that that's a typographical myth. Generally, serif fonts are more traditional and old style, while sans serif typefaces are seen as modern and futuristic. However, these broad adjectives can easily be challenged with typefaces from both categories that defy such classification. So whether you choose serif or sans, there are a plethora of great choices within both categories. To learn more about type classifications, you can start by looking up commonly used categories like geometric, humanist, old style, modern, transitional, slab serif, and you can always come up with your own groups and labels for your own collection of typefaces. That way you can get more organized and easily reach out for the type of font that you need. And I will say this about serif fonts. The reason why you see most books in a serif font is the little feet lead you from one letter to the next visually, and that is why almost every book is typeset with a serif font. So again, here you can see no feet and feet. Next, we have corresponding or contrast. So we have that sans serif impact, boom, right there, or bar Sophia, which forms an interesting contrast as well. So when two design elements are placed next to each other, they only create a remarkable impact, get it? Because I have the font impact there, if they correspond or they contrast. In the current context, this basically means that multiple typefaces should only be used together if they match. That means that they correspond, or they present an engaging divergence. They contrast each other. However, if you use two typefaces that are significantly similar, yet different enough to cause confusion over whether they are the same or not, you're actually going to end up distracting the reader from what's really important, and that's the content that they're supposed to be reading. An example of this would be picking two similar typefaces from the same category, such as geometric or old style. So that would mean, let's say that you used Garamond for one paragraph, and then your second paragraph you use Times New Roman. They're kind of similar, but they're different, so it'll really throw people reading your two paragraphs off. Of course, there's rarely any need to use multiple typefaces if one will do. And a lot of people forget this rule. So if you're happy with how your web page or your print page looks using a single typeface, there really isn't a need to introduce another one just for the sake of it. And remember that going forward. You know, by using different weights, such as bold versus regular or regular versus light, maybe adding some italics to make certain parts stand out, or even condensing some type to make it, you know, not stand out, you can have effective variation using the same typeface. So it's always useful to work with typefaces that come from a pretty extended type family. So experiment or fall back. You know, Helvetica is great, but sometimes, you know, you're just in the mood for champagne and limousines, you know, a different font. Over time, you'll start building a collection of typefaces that have served you well. We all do it as designers. I have been known to kind of go back to I call it my stable of typefaces. They're my tried and true typefaces that I know no matter what, they're my workhorses. They're going to get the job done for me. And it can be a little bit scary sometimes to venture from that. You know, these could be the top 20 typefaces that were literally taken straight from Font Shop's 100 best list, or they could be the result of your own personal experience. Either way, building this list is essential, as you will need it in times when nothing seems to be working. And believe me, we've all been there. There's a reason why typefaces such as Helvetica and Universe are so widely acclaimed, and it has to do with how versatile, robust, and reliable they are. You can use these trusted typefaces kind of like a safe safety blanket. You can always return to them with peace of mind in case the cool new font you downloaded from an independent typeface designer site or a flashy display font, double crosses you and threatens to put your design in jeopardy. You know that you have some tried and true typefaces just waiting in the wings to come in and save the day. That's not to say, though, that you should always play it safe. The biggest risk is really not taking one at all, and there are always opportunities for experimenting. So feel free to try out new typefaces that are versatile and reliable while adding something refreshing and individualistic to your list of favorites. Remember, everyone has access to tried and tested best of lists, but only the best designers possess skill, knowledge, and intuition to successfully utilize a new or unconventional typeface. And then finally, do you follow the rules or do you break the rules? Caution, and I will say this all the time, you should only break the rules if you know what the actual rules are and you understand why they are a rule. You can't break a rule if you don't understand the rule yet. Sometimes the process means nothing if the result isn't worthy. At the end of the day, we utilize typography to effectively convey written communication. If you think that purpose is best served by using a display font across the entire website or using a variety of sans and serif typefaces in conjunction, then go for it. I can't stop you. But as you can probably tell from even the descriptions, these instances of creativity are very volatile and they need to be dealt with very carefully. Only when you are knowledgeable about typography and familiar with its conventions and rules are you in a position to break the existing rules to successfully produce something new and compelling. Typography can be approached both systematically and intuitively, and there are no hard and fast rules, but there are a lot of guidelines. You really need to know your basics before you can try to get innovative. So to answer the question posed, what's your type? Remember, we were saying, what's your type? My go-to font these days is, if I'm designing a website, it's called Sans Serif or Sans Pro. It's a sans serif font, and I really, really enjoy it. And if I'm designing a print piece, I really do fall back on Futura. I think I am a Futura when I took that quiz. And then you might also notice when you're looking at different types that there are a bunch of font formats out there, and you might notice it based on the file extension in your fonts. We do have OpenType fonts, we have PostScript fonts, and we have TrueType fonts. And those are the three different font formats that are out there. So OpenType is actually a new standard for digital type fonts. It was developed jointly by Adobe and Microsoft. So OpenType means that it's going to work on your Mac and it's going to work on your Windows machine. The same exact font. You don't need a Mac version of the font and a PC version of the font. You really used to have to do that. It was such a pain. Then there's also PostScript fonts, and that's a worldwide printing and imaging standard. And then there's also TrueType fonts, which is a standard for digital type fonts that was developed by Apple Computer, and it was subsequently licensed to Microsoft. And each company has made independent extensions to TrueType, which is used in both Windows and Macintosh operating systems. So like Type 1 and TrueType, the TrueType format is available for development of new fonts. I personally think the best version to use if you have it at your disposal is an OpenType font. I find that I have the least amount of problems loading OpenType fonts. All right, so here's some typography tips for you. It is difficult to read typefaces whose strokes are really extreme. So they can be too light or they can be too heavy. The only time I think it's okay to break this rule is in a headline. When you're looking for something that's really going to stand out, I think it's okay then. But typefaces with too much of a thick, thin contrast might also be difficult to read if it's set really small, because those thin strokes, the smaller the font gets, they tend to begin to disappear to our eye. Expanded or condensed fonts are more difficult to read due to their distortion, again, especially for body copy. Body copy that is set in all caps, do not do it. It is so difficult to read because your eye needs that up and down of each of the letters. Otherwise, the lines just start literally looking like lines to our eyes. And that has to do with the contrast. So value contrast between type and ground increases readability. Make sure your background isn't conflicting with your type. It's more difficult to read highly saturated colors, especially when they're positioned on other highly saturated colors. So bright red type on a bright green background, difficult to read. Our eye doesn't know where to focus. Type over imagery is harder to read, and small white type on a dark background can be harder to read, especially on a screen. And people tend to read darker colors first. So, think of that when you're trying to draw someone in for your headline. There's a reason why we see those headlines in big, bold fonts, and our eyes are instantly drawn. The first thing you probably saw on this page was typography tips before you saw anything else. And then we have the 8 rules for creating effective typography. How do we put it all together on the screen? Number 1, learn the basics. The first step towards more effective typography is to learn a bit about the art. Type is an art. Fonts are an art. They really are. The anatomy of a typeface involves very specific jargon, precise measurements, and general standards that must be known and respected. And that is so true, the respecting part. As with many forms of design, you can only get away with breaking a rule if you know it well and are doing it intentionally to make a statement. And that's why we say don't distort the fonts. Don't squeeze them to make them condensed. Don't expand them to make them expanded. Find a condensed or an expanded version of that font, and if one is not available, pick a different typeface. The reason why is that font was designed with a precise measurement. There's a mathematical equation that goes into every single letter of every single font that makes it, sit correctly next to the letter next to it. And when you start to skew things, you mess up the math of the font. So there's a reason, that's the reason why we say don't do that. That's one of the biggest rules that you should never break. Number 2, watch your kerning. Kerning involves adjusting the space between 2 letters in a given font. Note, this is separate than the issue of tracking, which just adjusts the space between all the letters at the same time. You might think that an expensive program like Adobe Illustrator would automatically solve all of your kerning woes for you, and that this is therefore not a problem that arises in your artwork. However, think again. If you're not used to looking for kerning issues, the problems that I'm pointing out to you in the word default might be subtle, but they're definitely there. Notice how the uppercase D in the example, it starts to stand out significantly from the rest of the word, and that's because this space is way too big. We need to start to scoot the E over, so that the curve of the E is probably right about here. And then the same thing, this space right here is way too big. So if we start to scoot the U over, so the ascender starts right about here and kind of lines up with the serif at the bottom of the A, visually it brings these 2 letters together. See how this gently overlaps the L? That's good kerning right there. The same with the space between the L and the T. If we scooted the T over to right about here, our eye will go right into the next letter. So that's why your kerning is so important. And then be aware of that font communication. Font selection should never be an arbitrary process. Simply looking through your entire library to find a font that you will like will rarely produce an effective result. The reason is that there's an inherent psychology associated with certain types of fonts. This beautiful script doesn't really go with wrestling match. Cooper's Standard does not go for wedding day. Formal dinner, this is not a very formal font. And then, Old English for hair salon, I'm worried I'm going to come out looking like Shakespeare. So, you really need to understand that fonts have a certain mood, and you need to use the right mood. Alignment. Alignment is an extremely important concept in typography. For some reason, non-designers tend to instinctively center align everything. Have you ever gotten something from your mom and it's a typed up, or have you ever gotten, you know, from that cousin somewhere, a typed up newsletter at Christmas time that's 3 pages long on what's going on with their family, and the entire thing is center aligned. It's difficult to read, but for some reason, non-designers tend to instinctively center everything. Somewhere in life, we learned that if something is centered, then it must be balanced, and therefore that makes it better. But in reality, center alignment is the weakest and hardest to read alignment. So it should really be used very selectively. The easiest to read alignment is plain old left rag right here. Easiest to use. Justified, also difficult to read because our eye doesn't remember what line we were on. Number 5, choose a good secondary font. You know, we always talk about the headline font and our main font, but what about that secondary font to go with it? After you've chosen a primary typeface, the next step is to choose another font that's going to accent it. This is as opposed to a font that will conflict with your primary choice. So there are a couple of different problems in my first example right here. The first is that the types of fonts that are chosen to be put together are pretty poor. The supporting font is more ornate and actually harder to read than my primary font, and it's also being used in a smaller typeface. So this ends up distracting from my primary font. So therefore, I want to avoid that. Also, even if the first problem wasn't an issue, the two fonts are similar in thickness. And that similarity, because of that similarity, they really should be used together. So even though they are drastically different in style, their similar stroke weight doesn't provide enough visual contrast between the two of them. The second example uses a more appropriately contrasting font and utilizes a thinner, simpler font for the subtag. So this just feels better than this. Also, number 6, size matters. Headlines should grab the reader instantly. You have a second or two at best to get someone's attention in the print world. If you miss an opportunity, you've lost your potential customer or a potential client. What this means practically is that when you're creating a headline, don't simply type it out. You need to design it. You know, this is way more effective than this example. You could win a trip for 4 to the Bahamas. The first thing that jumps out at me is win the Bahamas. And I think to myself, it has been -7 here the last 2 weeks. I want to go to the Bahamas. You know, so otherwise, this is just typeset. This is just simply typed out. You could win a trip for 4 to the Bahamas. Oh, okay, that's cool. But nothing's jumping out at me like this. This is designed. This is a designed headline. This is just typeset. Number 7, use typography as art. I mean, how cool are these examples right here? Stop thinking of typography as simply headlines or body copy and start thinking of it as a design element. Typefaces are meticulously designed and therefore they possess an aesthetic that can be a valuable asset to your design arsenal. This of course goes well beyond, you know, building faces with letters. If you want to create a typography-centric design, think about how you can incorporate attractive type as your hero of your art. And then 8, find some good inspiration. The best way to learn to create effective and attractive typography is to find and study some examples that are already out there. Good and bad typography examples are as close as the nearest fast food restaurant. Keep a lookout everywhere you go for what others are doing and think about why it does, but also think about why it doesn't work well. Seriously, and if you find good examples, keep them. I used to put up on my wall of my bedroom when I was in high school examples, great examples of type that I found in print ads, in posters, great examples of graphic design, and a lot of them were centered around fonts and the font choices that were made. I took graphic design in high school, and I was such a font nerd, and that's what I did. I plastered my walls with great examples of type, and I think my mom for a while there was a little bit concerned. She gets it now. Not really. She still doesn't quite understand what I do. All right, so here's some common mistakes in typography, and we've all made them. You know, you have your text too close to the edge of the page. The text is too close to some other items such as graphics or pictures. The text is unreadable over the background. You've used all caps in your body text. You have too much of that handwritten font, you know, the font that looks like handwriting. I can't read people's handwriting to begin with, never mind a font, an entire paragraph of text that way. Inconsistent spacing after paragraphs, it can kind of throw the reader's eyes off. Too many effects, you know, blurred, shading, blends, bevels, shadows, gradients, fills all over your text. You've outlined your body text so my eyes can't focus, or your body text is too large or too bolded. That can be very difficult to read. And then I have a couple of great links for you guys too to check out on your own. All right, so I am going to, you know, it's 7:08 my time. Why don't we take a quick 5-minute break, and when we come back, I'll start up the next recording, and we will jump into our assessment and then a demo of our assignment. Does that sound good? And I'll actually stop the recording now, so that way people can just start up the recording on the next one. All right, so it's 7:09. Let's come back, 7:09 my time, Eastern Standard Time. Let's come back at 7:15.